Limitless Drive, Racing Against Time by Penny Swift. Chapter 1. The Starting Line. The sound of roaring engines filled the night air, vibrating through the asphalt of the underground racing circuit. The city was alive with energy, neon lights flashing, crowds cheering, and the anticipation of the race ready to explode. The street racers gathered at the starting line, their vehicles gleaming under the artificial lights, their tires burning with the promise of speed. In the midst of the chaos stood Jake, his hands resting on the cool metal of his car. His heartbeat in sync with the rhythmic hum of the engine, his mind calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had always been known for his composure, never letting the pressure of the race get to him. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything had changed. Jake wasn't just racing for pride, nor was he racing to prove himself. He was racing for something far more personal, something that could push him beyond his limits. The stakes had never been higher. Ready to lose, Jake, a voice shouted from behind him, cutting through the silence of his thoughts. It was Marcus, the reigning champion of the underground racing scene. He leaned against his sleek, modified muscle car, a cocky grin plastered across his face. His reputation was built on years of dominating these courses, but Jake had never been one to back down from a challenge. Jake turned his head slowly, meeting Marcus's smug gaze. "I don't plan on losing tonight," he said, his voice low but firm. His fingers brushed against the steering wheel as if reassuring himself of the power under his control. The two locked eyes for a moment, their rivalry palpable. Marcus had been the one to steal Jake's place at the top of the circuit years ago, and every race since had been a reminder of that loss. But this time, there was more on the line than just a title. The memory of his sister, Mia, flashed before his eyes. She was the reason Jake had gotten into racing in the first place, the reason he had pushed himself so hard to reach the top. But now, Mia was in danger, and the only way to save her was to win. Marcus's crew had something to do with it, and Jake had to make sure he came out on top tonight. 5 minutes, drivers. The announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, signaling the start of the race. The crowd roared, the tension building like a wave about to crash. Jake climbed into the driver's seat of his car, his fingers tightening around the wheel. He took a deep breath, his mind focusing on the track ahead. The underground circuit was notorious for its treacherous turns, narrow alleys, and unpredictable obstacles. But Jake had always thrived in high-pressure situations. He'd spent countless hours practicing, honing his skills to perfection. As the engine revved, Jake's focus sharpened. He glanced over at the other drivers, each of them locked in their own mental battle, preparing for the chaos to come. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Mia. His sister's face, pale and terrified, was burned into his memory. If he didn't win this race, if he didn't push himself beyond everything he thought he was capable of, she would pay the price. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The signal was given, and the screech of tires on pavement shattered the night. The cars shot forward, tearing down the street like missiles, engines screaming in fury. Jake's car surged ahead, its modified engine roaring to life as the other racers tried to keep up. The first turn was sharp, a tight corner that had claimed many a racer's chance at victory. But Jake was ready. He shifted gears, steering his car into the turn with a precision that came from years of practice. His tires screeched as they gripped the road, but he kept his foot firmly on the gas. The race was a blur of flashing lights, sharp turns, and the constant roar of engines. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he expertly navigated the course. But Marcus was right behind him, his car glued to Jake's bumper, pushing him to go faster, harder, further. The first lap passed in what felt like an instant, and Jake was in the lead, barely. He could see the danger ahead, the series of tunnels and obstacles that lay just beyond the next turn. He'd raced this course hundreds of times, but tonight, the sense of urgency was overwhelming. Every corner, every second, every shift of the gears felt amplified. Suddenly, a sharp flash of headlights appeared from the shadows, a car, drifting dangerously close to the edge of the track, swerving in an attempt to pass him. It was Marcus. He had found his moment to strike. Jake gritted his teeth. He could feel Marcus pushing him, trying to force him into a mistake. But he refused to give in. The memory of Mia kept him grounded, kept him focused. He couldn't afford to mess this up. Not now that, as they approached the next series of bends, Marcus attempted to overtake him. The two cars were neck and neck, their engines roaring in tandem, the tension so thick you could almost feel it in the air. Jake's palms were slick with sweat, but he wasn't going to let Marcus win. Not again. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor, taking a sharp left turn that caused his tires to screech in protest. The car slid sideways, but Jake kept it under control, narrowly avoiding the concrete barrier on his left. Marcus wasn't so lucky. His car drifted too wide and slammed into the guardrail, sending sparks flying into the night. The crowd gasped, and Jake's heart skipped a beat as he glanced in his rearview mirror. Marcus's car was out of the race, his engine sputtering to a halt as the damage took its toll. Jake didn't have time to feel sympathy. He needed to keep going. As the final stretch of the race approached, Jake's car surged ahead, its engine roaring with an intensity that matched his determination. The finish line loomed in the distance, and for the first time that night, Jake allowed himself to believe he might actually win. But even as he pushed toward victory, the weight of what was to come hung over him like a shadow. He crossed the finish line, the crowd's roar deafening in his ears. But the celebration felt hollow. The race had been won, but the real challenge had just begun. Jake knew that Marcus wasn't the only one he had to outrun, and that the dangers awaiting him were far greater than any finish line could offer. As he pulled off the track, his mind raced with thoughts of what was next. He had won the race, but now it was time to face the consequences, and no matter what it took, Jake was determined to keep going. Chapter 2: The Price of Victory. The roar of the crowd still echoed in Jake's ears as he brought his car to a halt at the edge of the track. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but beneath it, there was a gnawing sense of unease. The race was over, but the real challenge was only just beginning. Jake opened the door of his car and stepped out, his muscles still tense, his hands shaking from the aftermath of the race. His victory felt distant, hollow. He glanced at the wreckage of Marcus's car, still smoldering on the side of the track. A part of him felt relief that he had outmaneuvered his rival, but the rest of him couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's win had cost him more than he had bargained for. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement, their cheers filling the air as they circled him. Jake offered a quick nod and a half-hearted wave, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the one person who could provide the answers he desperately needed. And then he saw her. Lena stood by the edge of the track, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had been his closest ally in the underground racing scene for years, a fellow racer turned mechanic who had always had his back. But tonight, her usual warm smile was absent. Instead, there was a quiet intensity in her eyes, a sharpness that made Jake uneasy. He made his way toward her, pushing through the throng of people. The moment he reached her, she gave him a stern look. "You're getting reckless, Jake," she said, her voice low but firm. "You can't keep racing like this. Not with everything on the line." Jake clenched his jaw, trying to suppress the surge of frustration that rose within him. "I had no choice, Lena. You saw what happened out there. I had to win. I had to push harder than ever." Lena's eyes softened for a moment, but her stance remained unwavering. "You're not the only one with something to lose, you know. You're playing a dangerous game, and you're dragging everyone else down with you." Jake's chest tightened, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he expected. Lena had been the one to warn him from the start. She had always seen the risks, the dangers, in ways that Jake had chosen to ignore. But tonight it felt different. The stakes were higher. And it wasn't just about winning the race anymore. It was about saving his sister. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I know, but you don't understand. Mia's in trouble. I need the money from the sponsors to get her out. Marcus, his crew, they're holding something over her head. If I don't win this next race, if I don't keep pushing, I don't know what will happen to her." Lena's eyes flickered with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Marcus? His crew?" She shook her head. "Jake, that's a whole different level of danger. You think winning one race is going to get you out of this? You're playing into their hands." "I don't have a choice," Jake replied, his voice harder now. "I'm not going to lose her. Not like this." Lena took a deep breath, studying him carefully. Her lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't argue further. She knew Jake too well to push him when he was this determined. "I'll help you, Jake," she said finally, her voice softer. "But you need to be smart about this. One race won't be enough. You have to think long term, and you have to start making the right moves." Jake nodded, though the pit in his stomach only deepened. He had no idea what the right moves were. All he knew was that he had to keep winning. For Mia. for her safety, but something in Lena's gaze told him that even she wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. The next few days were a blur of planning, strategizing, and sleepless nights. Jake and Lena worked together to analyze the upcoming races, mapping out the best courses, the most dangerous turns, the moments when every ounce of skill would be required. But no matter how many laps Jake ran in his mind, no matter how many tactics they discussed, the feeling of dread never left him. The second race of the night was approaching, and Jake knew that this time it would be even harder. Marcus was out of the picture for now, but his influence remained. The underground world didn't forgive easily, and Jake was quickly becoming a target. Lena stood beside him as they checked the car, adjusting the engine and ensuring everything was running smoothly. Jake's nerves were tight, his hands restless as he ran them over the surface of the car, but his mind kept drifting back to the moment that had changed everything, the moment Mia had been taken. He remembered her face, pale and filled with fear, as she had called him days ago. She had been caught in a deal gone wrong, a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was part of. And now it was up to him to fix it. "Are you sure about this?" Lena asked, breaking him from his thoughts. Her voice was full of concern. "I've seen what happens when racers get too deep into the game. You're playing with fire, Jake." Jake looked at her, his eyes steely with resolve. "I don't have a choice." The moment of hesitation between them felt longer than it was. Finally, Lena sighed and handed him a small, black box. "This is for the race after next," she said quietly. "It's a mod for the engine. It'll give you the edge you need to stay ahead. Use it wisely." Jake took the box, his fingers brushing hers as he did. He didn't speak, but his nod said everything. He had to win. There was no turning back now. The night of the second race arrived, and the city seemed to hum with energy. The lights, the crowd, the roar of engines, it all felt like a fever dream. But Jake knew that this was more than just a race. This was the moment that would determine everything. As he sat in his car, the engine purring beneath him, he couldn't help but think about the road that had led him here. His need to prove himself, to be the best, had brought him to this point. But now it wasn't about that. It wasn't about the title or the fame. It was about Mia. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The signal was given, and the world exploded into motion. Jake slammed the pedal to the metal, his car shooting forward with the power of a beast unleashed. The road ahead was dangerous, but Jake didn't hesitate. He was in control, and he wasn't going to lose. Not tonight. Chapter 3. The Edge of Control. The lights blurred in a streak of neon as Jake's car surged ahead, the engine's roar consuming everything in its path. The crowd's cheers faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. His focus was razor sharp, each movement, each gear shift, flowing with precision and speed. The second race had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The road twisted and turned, a challenging maze of tight corners and sharp drops, all under the cover of darkness. Jake knew the course like the back of his hand, but tonight it felt different, more dangerous, more unforgiving. His thoughts drifted back to Mia, her pale face and trembling voice calling out to him in desperation. He couldn't afford to fail her. The first stretch of the race was smooth, the tires gripping the asphalt as he powered through the initial straights. But it didn't take long for the pack to close in. Other racers were hungry, driven by pride, ambition, or the same desperation that gnawed at Jake's core. He glanced in his rearview mirror, catching sight of his main competitor, a tall figure in a custom-built car that glinted under the streetlights. Alex, known for his aggressive driving style and ability to maneuver through tight spaces, Alex was no stranger to winning. But Jake wasn't about to let him take this victory. Ahead, the track narrowed, forcing the cars to squeeze through a series of sharp turns, each one a test of skill and control. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his focus unwavering. As he approached the bend, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, his entire body syncing with the movements of the car. He could feel the tires skimming the edge of danger, but he held steady, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator. Alex, however, had a different strategy. The last possible moment, Alex swung wide, using the extra space to push forward. Jake didn't have time to think. Instinct took over. He fought to keep control of his car, forcing it to cut through the narrow gap without losing speed. The tires screeched, the friction between rubber and road creating an unbearable sound that sent a chill through his bones. For a moment, it seemed as though the car would spin out, but Jake's practiced hands held steady, guiding the vehicle through the turn. He made it, but barely did. As Jake pulled ahead, he could see Alex's car just behind him, the headlights bright and unforgiving. The sound of the engine behind him was like a growl, relentless in its pursuit. Every inch Jake gained, Alex seemed to close the gap. Jake knew he couldn't afford another mistake. The finish line was close. He pressed the button on the dashboard, activating the engine mod Lena had given him. There was a brief surge of power, an almost imperceptible boost that sent the car lurching forward. The acceleration was instant and overwhelming. Jake's stomach lurched, but he kept his grip tight, pushing forward through the tight curves of the track. The final stretch was coming up. It was a long, straight road, but with a sharp curve right at the end, a deadly turn that could easily end the race for anyone too eager to get ahead. Jake's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. Alex wasn't far behind. His car was practically on Jake's tail, but with the boost from Lena's mod, Jake had gained enough distance to make it to the curve first. It was his to lose. As he reached the straight, he let go of the tension in his shoulders for just a moment. He could feel the wind rushing past, the world opening up in front of him. The finish line was now within sight, but as the curve loomed ahead, he knew the risk wasn't over. Not yet. His hands danced over the controls, smoothly downshifting just as he approached the bend. His tires bit into the asphalt, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. But then, just as he started to turn, he saw it, a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. ACAR. IT came from the side, a black blur darting across the track, cutting off his line. It wasn't part of the race. This wasn't part of the plan. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the car barreled toward him. Without thinking, he swerved, narrowly avoiding the collision. His tires screeched in protest as the car slid, skidding dangerously close to the guardrail. For a moment, it seemed as though everything would spin out of control. But Jake fought the car back onto the track, gripping the wheel with all his strength. He couldn't let this happen. Not now. Not when he was so close. The black car disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, but the damage was done. Jake's car was off course for a split second, just enough for Alex to catch up. A surge of panic shot through Jake's chest as Alex's car swerved to the side, now neck and neck with him. The two cars hurtled toward the final curve together, the finish line just beyond it. Jake pushed every ounce of concentration into his next move. It was all or nothing. As they approached the curve, Jake didn't hesitate. He took the turn wide, letting the car drift at the perfect angle to stay on the inside track. Alex, desperate to push ahead, cut too early, his tires screeching as he lost grip. It was just enough for Jake to pull ahead, the finish line rushing toward him with every second. And then, finally, with a final push of power, Jake crossed the line. The crowd erupted in a deafening cheer. But all Jake could hear was the pounding of his heart in his ears. He had won. But at what cost? As he slowed his car, bringing it to a stop, his mind raced with the events that had just unfolded. The black car, who was it? What was their purpose? And why had they interfered now, of all times? He stepped out of the car, his body still trembling from the rush of the race. But this time, the exhilaration was short-lived. The victory was bittersweet. Mia's face flashed in his mind again, the reality of what he had to do sinking in. Before he could take another step, a figure approached him from the shadows, someone he didn't expect to see here. Nice driving, Jake. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that voiced at IT was Marcus. Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty. Jake's breath caught in his throat as Marcus emerged from the shadows, his tall frame casting an imposing figure against the flickering lights of the track. The unmistakable smirk on Marcus's face sent a cold shiver down Jake's spine. "Did you enjoy the race, Jake?" Marcus's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it that made Jake's blood run colder. "It was almost impressive, even for you." Jake took a step back, his eyes scanning the area. The crowd had begun to disperse, but there were still a few lingering faces in the distance, some familiar, others not so much. The last thing he wanted was for any of them to see the confrontation that was about to unfold. He crossed his arms, trying to mask his unease. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" Marcus chuckled, the sound rich with amusement. "Relax, Jake. I'm just here to congratulate you on the win. Though, I'm sure you already know the race wasn't the only thing on the line tonight." Jake's fists clenched. He had known Marcus was involved in more than just racing, but hearing the words out loud made it feel more real, more dangerous. The truth that had been lurking beneath the surface now felt unavoidable. Mia, his sister, wasn't just a pawn in Marcus's games. She was a hostage. You think this is funny? Jake's voice was low, tinged with anger. You think putting her in danger is a joke? Marcus shrugged nonchalantly. You can call it whatever you want. But let's not pretend you didn't know what you were getting into when you started racing with us. This is the life you chose, Jake. You and Mia both. Jake took a step toward Marcus, every instinct in him telling him to lash out, to make Marcus feel the fear and anger that had been building up inside of him for months. But he knew better. Marcus wasn't just another rival. He was a force to be reckoned with. And getting into a physical confrontation would do nothing but make things worse. What do you want? Jake forced the words out through gritted teeth. I want what's mine, Marcus replied, his eyes gleaming with cold certainty. And I'm here to remind you of that. You'll race for me. You'll win for me. Or things get a lot more uncomfortable for your sister. The threat was clear, and it hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Mia wasn't just a collateral. She was the lever. And Jake had no choice but to comply if he wanted to keep her safe. But there was something in Marcus's words that didn't sit right with Jake. A lingering feeling that all of this, Mia's safety, the pressure to keep racing, was part of something larger. The games, the manipulation, the violence, it wasn't just about racing anymore. It was about control. Jake inhaled deeply, trying to center himself. You won't get away with this. I won't be your puppet. Marcus raised an eyebrow, almost as if he were waiting for Jake to make his next move. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engines idling in the distance, the soft murmur of the remaining crowd. Then, Marcus's voice broke the silence again. You think you have a choice? You really think you can walk away from this? After everything I've done for you? After everything you owe me? The words were cutting, each one a reminder of how tangled Jake's life had become in Marcus's world. He had started racing to survive, to feel the rush of speed, to escape the life that had never quite fit him. But now, racing was a noose tightening around his neck. And Mia was the weight pulling him down. I'm not going to keep playing your game, Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. You've got Mia, but that won't last forever. I'll find a way out. Marcus studied him for a moment, his smile never faltering. Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, something that looked like a phone or a pager. He clicked a button, and the screen illuminated, showing a picture of Mia. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and the scene behind her looked like some sort of warehouse. Jake's stomach twisted. The image was enough to remind him just how much danger she was in. Do you want to keep playing tough guy, Jake? Marcus asked, the amusement now gone from his tone. Because I can make it so that your sister doesn't make it through the night. Jake's heart raced, his breath shallow. He fought the urge to lunge at Marcus, to take the device from his hand and destroy it, but he knew that would only make things worse. I'll do whatever you want. Jake said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. But you're not controlling me. I'm doing this for Mia. You'll never break me. Marcus smiled again, but this time there was a coldness to it. Good. I like that fire. You'll need it. But remember, Jake, you don't get to walk away. Not until I say so. With that, Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows with the device still in hand. Jake stood there, frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The race was over, but the real battle had just begun. Marcus wasn't just a competitor. He was a kingpin, and Jake was now a pawn in his twisted game. Jake looked around, as if searching for something to ground him. Lena had warned him, but even she couldn't have known how deep Marcus's grip went. But Jake wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. Mia was counting on him, and no matter what, Jake wasn't going to let her down. Later that night, as Jake sat alone in his garage, the weight of the confrontation with Marcus still heavy on his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. He had to make his next move carefully. If he wanted to get Mia back, he needed to outsmart Marcus, to turn the tables. And that meant playing the game, but on his own terms. But as the sound of the engines from the night's race faded into the distance, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had been right about one thing. There was no turning back. Chapter 5. Into the Abyss. The days that followed felt like a blur. Jake couldn't shake the image of Mia, trapped in that cold, sterile warehouse. The thought of her alone and scared twisted something deep inside of him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see her face, vulnerable and desperate, pleading with him without a single word. And Marcus, his grip on her was unrelenting, like a shadow Jake couldn't escape, but Jake wasn't one to give up. Not now. Not when Mia needed him the most. He had to play Marcus's game, at least for now. He had to stay under the radar, to keep racing, to make it through without drawing too much attention. Every time he got behind the wheel, it felt like a step closer to the edge. But each victory, each race won, was a small victory for Mia too. It was all about survival, not just for him, but for her. Jake's thoughts raced as he sat in the dim light of his garage, the hum of the engine still ringing in his ears. He had been working on his car for hours, tweaking every small detail, trying to make it perfect. It had to be. If he was going to race for Marcus, he needed to be faster, sharper, better than ever before. The door to the garage creaked open, and Jake looked up to see Lena standing in the doorway. She looked more serious than usual, her expression unreadable. "Lena," Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What are you doing here?" She stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. "We need to talk." Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned back against the car. "About what?" "About Marcus," Lena said, her voice low and cautious. "I've been doing some digging, and it's worse than we thought." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Lena hesitated for a moment, glancing around the garage as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I've been tracking his movements. His network. And it's not just about the races. He's tied into something much bigger, Jake. Something dangerous. Jake straightened, the gravity of her words settling in. He had known Marcus was no ordinary criminal. But this was something else. What do you mean? What's he involved in? Lena crossed her arms, her brow furrowed with concern. Marcus isn't just running an underground racing ring. He's got ties to the cartel, to human trafficking, money laundering, and worse. He's been using the races as a cover for his illegal activities. And Mia? She's not just a hostage. She's a piece in his larger game. Jake felt his stomach churn. The horror of Lena's words hit him like a punch to the gut. Mia wasn't just caught in the middle of Marcus's twisted race for power. She was being used as leverage in a criminal empire. What does he want? Jake's voice was tight with anger. Why her? Lena took a deep breath. Because Mia knows things. She has information that could ruin him. She's been digging into his operations, trying to expose him, and now he's holding her as insurance. If she talks, he'll lose everything. So he's keeping her close, making sure she stays silent. Jake's mind raced, trying to process everything Lena was saying. Mia, the one person he trusted more than anyone, had been digging into Marcus's empire, trying to bring him down. And now she was paying the price for it. Jake felt a surge of determination rise in him. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to do something. But what? How could he get her out? What can we do? Jake asked, his voice firm. Lena looked at him, her gaze intense. We have to move quickly. I've been in contact with a few people on the inside. There's a safe house where we can take Mia once we get her out. But it won't be easy. Marcus has eyes everywhere. We'll need a plan. Jake nodded. I'm listening. Lena sighed, running a hand through her hair. First, we need to get you back in the races. You've been off the radar for a while, but Marcus is expecting you. He's watching. But there's one race coming up that could be our chance. It's a big one, bigger than anything you've done before. We use it as a distraction. Jake raised an eyebrow. A distraction? How? Lena smiled, but it wasn't the usual playful grin she wore. This was something different, strategic, calculating. You're going to use your race as a cover. We'll get Mia out during the chaos. While you're racing, we'll have people on the inside pulling the strings, getting her out of that warehouse. Jake's pulse quickened. It was risky, dangerous, and had the potential to backfire in ways he couldn't even imagine. But it was the only shot they had. When is this race? Lena's smile widened. This weekend. The tension in the air was palpable as the night of the race drew closer. Jake couldn't focus on anything but the plan. The strategy. The danger. Everything hinged on him, on his ability to outdrive, to outsmart, to stay alive long enough to get me out. The moment he stepped into his car that night, he felt the weight of it all. The engine purred beneath him, a smooth, powerful rhythm. But the thoughts swirling in his mind kept pulling him back into the reality of what was at stake. Mia was counting on him. The crowd began to gather. the familiar sounds of engines revving and tires screeching filling the air. The race was about to begin, but this time, it wasn't just about winning. It was about survival. It was about proving to Marcus that Jake wasn't just a pawn in his game. As the starting signal blared, Jake's foot slammed on the accelerator, the car lurching forward. The race had begun. Chapter 6: Breaking Free. The final race was everything Jake had trained for, everything he had endured, everything he had fought for. As the engines roared to life and the starting signal blared, the world around him seemed to fade into a blur. There was only the road, only the curve of the track, only the rush of adrenaline in his veins. This was no ordinary race. This was his chance to outwit Marcus. This was the moment when everything could change. He had no choice but to win. Jake pushed his foot harder onto the accelerator, the engine growling beneath him as he tore down the track, maneuvering with precision and speed. The familiar rush of the race surged through him, but it wasn't enough to block out the thoughts of Mia. She was out there somewhere, still trapped by Marcus. She was counting on him to pull off the impossible. The night air was thick with tension as Jake weaved in and out of the other racers. His mind was razor sharp, focused solely on the road ahead. The stakes had never been higher. Marcus's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of the leverage he had over Mia. You race for me, Jake, or she suffers. But Jake couldn't let fear dictate his actions any longer. Mia had made the choice to take a stand, to fight back against Marcus's empire. Now it was his turn to fight for her. He wasn't going to let Marcus control him any longer. The finish line loomed ahead, but Jake's eyes weren't just on the prize. He had to stay sharp, stay aware. Lena had set everything in motion, and the plan was simple. Jake had to win, distract Marcus, and buy enough time for the people on the inside to get Mia out. As they neared the final stretch, the lead racer pulled ahead, but Jake wasn't concerned with that. This wasn't about winning the race. This was about surviving it. A flash of movement caught his eye. It was a signal from Lena. Something was happening. The plan was in motion. Jake's heart pounded. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, and he pushed the car to its limits, slamming into the final turn. The tires screeched as he powered through, his concentration unwavering. The finish line was in sight, but then a car swerved into his lane, blocking his path. Jake's instincts kicked in as he swerved just in time to avoid a collision, narrowly missing the edge of the track. His heart raced even faster, the danger surging through him. That was Marcus's move. Marcus had expected Jake to make a mistake, to falter under pressure. But Jake wasn't going to let him win. With a fierce determination, Jake slammed the accelerator down again, fighting for every inch. The finish line was now within reach, but the final obstacle was still there. He was nearly neck and neck with the other racer, the only one who had kept up with him through the chaos of the night. The roar of the engines filled the air as Jake shot ahead, pushing himself, pushing the car to its breaking point. The seconds stretched on as he surged past the other racer, the finish line now a mere blur of light. He could see it. He was going to make it. With one final, heart-stopping move, Jake crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Jake didn't hear them. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and his mind raced with the knowledge that the real victory wasn't in the race. It was in what came next. In the shadows of the track, Lena was already in motion. She had made her move. Jake's victory had created the perfect diversion. The people on the inside had been working tirelessly to get Mia out of Marcus's clutches, and now it was happening. Jake pulled into the pit stop, his hands trembling slightly as he slammed the car into park. He quickly jumped out, scanning the area for Lena. She was waiting for him near the exit, her face set in determined lines. "We did it," she said, her voice breathless but relieved. Jake's chest tightened with anticipation. "Where is she?" Lena didn't hesitate. "She's safe. We got her out. Marcus doesn't know yet." Jake's heart pounded, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. It had worked. They had done it. "Is she okay?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded. "She's shaken up, but she's alive. She's on her way to this safe house now." Jake felt a weight lift from his chest. He had done it. He had saved her. They had escaped the grasp of Marcus and his empire. But even though the immediate danger had passed, Jake knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a new chapter. He turned to Lena, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Lena smiled, but there was a sadness behind her eyes. "You'd have done the same for me. We look out for each other. That's what family does." Jake nodded, but his thoughts immediately turned to Mia. He couldn't wait to see her, to make sure she was truly safe, to hear her voice again. The plan had worked, but there was still so much left to do. Marcus wouldn't give up easily. He was dangerous, ruthless. And Jake knew he had to be ready for whatever came next. Lena placed a hand on his shoulder, bringing him back to the present. "You did good, Jake. But this isn't over. Marcus won't stop, and neither can we." Jake's jaw tightened. "We'll be ready. I won't let him hurt anyone else." Hours later, as Jake stood at the entrance of the safe house, the familiar sound of a car pulling up made his heart skip a beat. He turned just in time to see a figure emerge from the shadows. Mia. Her face was tired, her eyes dark from the ordeal, but when she saw Jake, her face broke into a small smile. She ran toward him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt the tension leave his body. He pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close, as if afraid to ever let go. "You're safe," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I should have gotten you out sooner." Mia shook her head, her hands gripping his shirt. "You did it, Jake. You saved me. You did everything you could." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. They had survived. They had beaten Marcus, at least for now. And together, They were stronger than ever. As they walked inside the safe house, the future seemed uncertain. But one thing was clear. They were no longer prisoners of Marcus's world. They had fought back, and they had won. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. But as Jake looked at Mia, he knew one thing for sure. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. And together, they could conquer anything.